Ut sementem feceris ita metes. As you sow, so shall you reap. Cicero. The lesson of history is that every decision has consequences. From every choice a person makes, there shoots a splintering road of possibilities. The outcomes of our choices may at times seem trivial, but we will never know the true measure of the waves we set in motion until they are judged by those highest of all judges, time and history. A triumphant conqueror sneers at the enemy he treads underfoot, a triviality in his eyes, but an act which his enemy will never forget. The captain of a warship holds short at the edge of a bloody battle, an act of cowardice, or perhaps an act that will go on to win the battle. A dying man breathes his last words, stern and plain, yet strong enough to blow flames into the hearts of men and give them the grit to endure the unendurable. All of these moments appear in this story, and all of them are crossroads in the course of history. To tell this story, we will look through the eyes of a few men. Men from seemingly distant and unconnected worlds, yet all of them intertwined by the weaving roads of destiny. A young sailor from Rhode Island with a quick temper, an officer in the US Navy, he had fought to clear his name in a court-martial, with everything to prove he had little left to lose. A European emperor, drunk on power, determined to bend an entire continent to his will, only to wreak everlasting change in a continent across the ocean. A humble ship's purser from Maryland, a career bureaucrat who had spent all his life balancing books and distributing rations of tobacco, before he went on to fearlessly fire the last cannon on a sinking ship. A freedom fighter born in the forests of Ohio to a Shawnee war chief, a man who would go on to fight one colonizer and ally himself to another, all the while striving to defend the dream of a nation for his people. A reticent, soft-spoken sailor, a patient watcher of the winds, whose patience would win him a battle against his enemy, but lose him forever the friendship of the man he fought beside. A religious leader, revered as a prophet, a diviner of destinies, a man who professed to converse with the Great Spirit, and who called on that Spirit to deliver vengeance on the thief of his lands. A Scotsman who climbed the ranks of the Royal Navy on the merit of his genius, a brilliant strategist and tactician who had captured 12 ships by the age of 18, a man who fought beside Horatio Nelson in the Battle of Trafalgar, and about whom it was said he surely could not be matched, until he was. And finally, the last character in this tale, a general in the US Army, a dogged advocate of territorial expansion, whose victories on the battlefield would eventually lead him to the highest office in his land, yet would also deliver him a curious twist of destiny. Our story begins in the year 1806. By this year, Napoleon Bonaparte was at the height of his power. He was France's self-crowned emperor, and by 1806 over half of Europe had been steadily consumed by his empire. And yet, there was one notable exception. You see, Great Britain had never bowed to Napoleon. She was a force to be reckoned with an empire of her very own, and a vast military at her fingertips. A constant thorn in Napoleon's side, Britain funded Napoleon's enemies, and indeed aided and abetted rebellions in his empire. Every time Napoleon sent warships to try and tame that troublesome island, its massive navy responded in force and repelled his invasions. The supreme humiliation came finally in the famous Battle of Trafalgar, where the British fleet eviscerated the combined navies of France and Spain. In a fury, Napoleon penned the Berlin Decree. This decree declared a new continental system whereby the import of any British goods into Europe and any territories associated with Napoleon's empire was forbidden. Britain, in short, was to be cut off from Europe through a total trade embargo. In response, the British passed their own decree, and in their decree they prohibited any of their trading partners from dealing with the French. Swiftly and surely, Napoleon's decision was sending waves of consequence across the world. Soon enough, these waves landed on the shores of the United States of America, who found herself caught in the middle of a dispute between two countries she traded with frequently. The mood in America was a hostile one. The young republic cared nothing for the petty quarrels of Europe. She had won her independence from a European empire not long ago, yet Britain, it seemed, still thought she could bar her from trading with others. In addition to this, Britain had done other things to infuriate America. Britain had allied herself to the Native American peoples of North America. This infuriated many citizens and politicians in the US who were eager for the Union to expand into the West. Britain funded and supplied Indian armies in the northwest so that they would raid and harass American outposts and deter the Americans from expanding westward closer to her territory in British North America. Britain hoped by funding this proxy warfare she could force America to agree to her plan of creating an autonomous Indian nation in the northwest. Britain hoped that this new nation could act as a kind of buffer state, separating British colonies from the ever-hungry United States. Most of America's leaders were enraged by Britain's suggestion of giving the Native Americans their own state, and this only served to further heighten hostility towards the British Empire in the United States. One of those most hostile to the British was a rising politician and army general, William Henry Harrison. Harrison was determined to see America's borders spread westwards and engulf the northwest regions around the Great Lakes. He flatly refused to conceive of a Native American nation there. Now, in 1809, Harrison was governor of the Indiana Territory, and he was intent on claiming more land westward for white American settlers. And so, he gathered a group of Native American tribal leaders in Fort Wayne, and there in Fort Wayne he negotiated a treaty with them, a treaty to buy 3 million acres of land in what comprises modern-day Illinois. As governor, Harrison had solemnly declared many times in public that he was against the sale of alcohol to the Native Americans, as, in his opinion, it was a vice to which they were unaccustomed and therefore easily affected by. However, during the treaty negotiations, he apparently forgot his previous convictions because he ordered barrels of whiskey to be distributed to all the Potawatomi, Lenape, and Miami negotiators. During the negotiations, the Native Americans were then allowed to drink 218 gallons of whiskey. By September 29th, 1809, the Fort Wayne Treaty had been signed, and suddenly the USA was 3 million acres greater. Whiskey and wiles had quelled any native objections, as the leaders of the tribes were encouraged to drink themselves into a stupor. Therefore it seemed that Native American objections had been all but quelled. Or so it seemed, for there was one loud voice raised in objection. A chief of the Shawnee tribe, who went by the name of Tecumseh, declared that no chief had the right to sell the lands of his people. The Shawnee people had, interestingly, been excluded from the treaty signing, and Tecumseh declared that this alone nullified any agreement Harrison had made with other tribal leaders. In August of 1810, Tecumseh was joined by his younger brother, Tenskwatawa, a prophet and religious leader. Together, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa marched an army of 400 warriors down the Wabash River to meet Harrison's troops as they were holed up in Vincennes. Caught off guard, Harrison hurriedly rode out to meet with Tecumseh and the other Shawnee chiefs. Once they were face to face, Tecumseh launched into a tirade against Harrison. He denounced Harrison's condescension and hubris. He insisted the Fort Wayne Treaty was illegitimate, and he warned Harrison not to settle the lands he had stolen. Tecumseh declared then that he was building a confederacy of Indian tribes, and if Harrison did not nullify the treaty he had signed, then Tecumseh would ally himself with the British, and he would use their help to forge a new indigenous nation. After this furious tirade, Harrison, it is said, sneered at Tecumseh and said, "If the Great Spirit you worship had wished you to be one nation, he would have made all your tribes speak one language." Tecumseh, incensed, screamed at Harrison in his Shawnee tongue. He called him a liar, and then he rode away with his companions. Waves of consequence rippled outward from the meeting of these two men standing on the banks of the Wabash River. A year later, Harrison met Tecumseh's brother, the prophet Tenskwatawa, at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Harrison marched to the Confederacy's capital, a place called Prophetstown. He marched there with an army of 1,000, intent on destroying the capital and thereby destroying the Indian Confederacy Tecumseh had promised. Surprised and woefully outgunned, the Native Americans there were routed by Harrison's soldiers. Tenskwatawa was unable to rally his warriors, and within a few hours nearly a fifth of the Native Americans there had fallen. Harrison burned Prophetstown to the ground and destroyed all their winter food supplies for good measure. When he returned home, Harrison was heralded as the hero of Tippecanoe, and his popularity propelled him to Washington to serve there in the House of Representatives. But as Prophetstown lay burning and as its people scattered to the four winds, Tenskwatawa, it is said, watched Harrison riding away, and in that moment the prophet uttered a curse in his ancient tongue, and called upon the Great Spirit to visit vengeance on the Great White Father. Not long after this, Tecumseh made good on his promise to Harrison, and the Indian Confederacy was allied to the British. Now, with the aid of British arms and supplies, they would regroup, resupply, and wage war on the United States of America. In the United States, animosity towards the British only continued to swell. Not only did Britain believe she could block her from trading with France, not only did Britain now arm her enemies against her, but in the past months the Royal Navy had intensified its practice of kidnapping American sailors from ships they had caught. The Royal Navy then disregarded the US citizenship of these sailors and forced them into service with the Royal Navy. In the eyes of Americans, it was time for Britain to be taught a lesson in respect. And so, on June 18th, 1812, the United States declared war on the British Empire. The US knew that in raw numbers Britain dwarfed her militarily. She had just 16 warships to Britain's 500. And so they were not going to fight Britain head-on. Instead, they would strike Britain on her soft underbelly. American forces would march up north to the Great Lakes and invade Britain's prized but vulnerable colony of British North America, or modern-day Canada. The aim was to capture Canadian territory and then use it as a bargaining chip against Britain to win the concessions they so badly wanted and bring the war to a swift close. While they were there, the American forces would also aim to destroy the Native American armies allied with the British, and thus end any hopes of an Indian nation in the Northwest. The plan was, in essence, to kill two birds with one stone. Well, that was the plan, anyway. However, the scheme did not develop as intended. American armies invaded Canada at 3 points, but all 3 campaigns ended in failure. One army surrendered at Detroit, on the western end of Lake Erie. A second army surrendered at the other end of the lake at Queenston Heights, and a third army retreated after only a small skirmish north of New York. The British and their Native American armies proved a formidable foe. By the end of 1812, the situation was dire. Instead of conquering British territory, the Americans had in fact lost land to the British. The British now controlled Detroit and Queenston Heights, giving them, in essence, control over the whole of Lake Erie, a crucial strategic body of water. If nothing was done, then America could lose its Ohio and Michigan territories to the British. In haste, the US Navy quickly built a motley squadron of warships at Presque Isle. They built 3 brigs, 5 schooners, and 1 sloop. It wasn't much, but the 2 brigs, Lawrence and Niagara, had 20 guns each, and together they at least could be a force to be reckoned with. A quick-tempered young officer from Rhode Island called Oliver Hazard Perry was awarded command of this ramshackle squadron. Master Commandant Perry was just 28, and a little under a year earlier he had faced a court-martial and a charge of negligence after a ship he commanded had run aground near Rhode Island. Perry had defended his name in this trial, proving, finally, that the fault lay elsewhere with the negligent pilots on board the ship at the time. Yet, even after his acquittal, the stink and indignity of the trial had haunted young Perry. However, he was a man who was not one to give up lightly. He was ambitious, and he had begged for command of the Presque Isle fleet, knowing that he had a bold plan to win back Lake Erie, the Michigan Territory, and his honour. He sailed his ships to Put-in Bay. There he was able to block supplies from reaching the British and indigenous armies who were dug in at Detroit. Perry knew that if he blockaded Detroit at Put-in Bay, he could force the hand of the British. The armies there in Detroit could not simply be left to starve, and so, therefore, the smaller, weaker British naval squadron on Lake Erie would be forced to engage him to try to end the blockade. A Scotsman named Robert Heriot Berkeley commanded the British squadron on Lake Erie. Commander Berkeley had just 6 vessels to Perry's 9, and only 2 of these were fully rigged ships, HMS Detroit and HMS Queen Charlotte. However, Berkeley was a brilliant strategist. He had fought in the Battle of Trafalgar, and he'd captured 12 ships in his time. And he knew that he possessed a singularly crucial advantage over Perry. He had 63 guns to Perry's 54, and what is more, he held some long-range cannon, which Perry did not. And so, in September 1813, Berkeley sailed down to engage Perry. At dawn on the 10th of September, a lookout spots the 6 British ships approaching Put-in Bay. Perry gives a flurry of orders and prepares to engage them. Perry takes command of the USS Lawrence. This 20-gun brig is named after his friend, Captain James Lawrence, a captain who died just a few months earlier fighting the British near Boston. Before he fell, Lawrence's last words to his men were brief but fierce. "Don't give up the ship." In memory of his fallen friend, Perry has had a flag made, emblazoned with those powerful words, and on the morning of the battle he raises that flag on the USS Lawrence. Perry's squadron set sail at 7 a.m. By 10 a.m. the weather shifts in his favour, and as he closes in towards the British, he has the wind at his back. Just before noon, the first shot is fired, but it is not by the Americans, not by Perry, but in fact by the British. On board HMS Detroit, with his long 24-pounder, Berkeley fires on the USS Lawrence at extreme range. The shot finds its mark, and the heavy cannonball punches through the Lawrence. 6 Americans are killed instantly. Perry can hardly believe the British have made a shot at that range. This is a grave realization because Perry knows that his smaller guns are much too far out of range to answer this attack. For the next 20 minutes, Perry struggles to bring the USS Lawrence closer to the British ships, but all the while she takes heavy fire on both sides. Finally, the Lawrence gets within range, and it is then that Perry unleashes a full broadside. 280 pounds of metal crash into the HMS Detroit. Commander Barclay is severely wounded in this blast, but he orders his men to fight on. The Detroit is now badly damaged, and at this moment Perry turns around, expecting to see his other heavy hitter, the USS Niagara, following in behind, ready to fire on HMS Queen Charlotte and press their advantage. But Niagara is nowhere to be seen. Niagara is another 20-gun brig, packing the firepower Perry so desperately needs, and she is captained by Jesse Elliott, a quiet and reticent sailor who chooses not to follow Perry straight into the line of fire. Instead, he has drawn nearly to a halt several hundred yards back on the edge of the battle. In fact, Captain Elliott is following the orders given to him by Commander Perry prior to the battle's beginning. He is holding his position in line with the other schooners. He is, in short, making sure not to break up their lines. And seeing how much fire the USS Lawrence is drawing, he chooses, rather than to take the same fate, instead to hold back and wait. He plans to wait for the British to burn through their gunpowder and lose their lines. Then he will draw in to counterstrike. Commander Perry, however, does not appreciate these considerations while staring at 40 British cannon aimed squarely at him. His hot temper burns to a flame, and he believes that Lieutenant Elliott has held back out of cowardice. And so, left alone and desperate, Perry orders the crew of the Lawrence to fight for everything they have. The crew are valiant, and they land many answering shots on the British, but by this time they are surrounded, pounded on all sides by relentless British salvos. By 2:30 p.m, the USS Lawrence is a floating wreck. In modern warfare, casualty rates of 10% are considered bloodbaths. On the USS Lawrence, in the space of 2 hours, 80% of the crew were killed, while the rest abandoned ship. Perry now faces the terrible prospect of surrendering to Robert Barclay. From his viewpoint on HMS Detroit, Commander Barclay nurses his wounds and watches on as his plan to overwhelm the Americans begins to fall into place. But then, a sudden, defiant shot is fired from the USS Lawrence with her last working cannon. On the gun deck, the ship's purser, Samuel Hambleton from Maryland, has been drafted in to help man the guns, and now his comrades lie fallen around him. And this man, who has never done more than order rations of biscuits and cheese, stands alone, wielding the last gun of the ship. In that moment, hope returns to Commander Perry. He pulls down the famous flag and, with the help of Samuel Hambleton, lowers one of the USS Lawrence's cutters into the water. Perry, Hambleton, and the last survivors row through a hailstorm of shot and smoke to the USS Niagara, a few hundred yards away. Perry takes over command of Niagara from Captain Elliott, and he sails her straight into the British jumbled lines. As he does this, he orders the men to raise the flag one last time, the flag sewn with those famous words, "Don't give up the ship. Once inside the jumbled British lines, Niagara unleashes both broadsides. A tremendous explosion emits from her, and it lands squarely into the British ships. The already battered British ships are now pummeled by hundreds of pounds of metal. And just as that happens, the wind picks up in the Americans' favour, allowing the American schooners to rush in and close the gap behind the British. Now there is no escape from the onslaught. Just after 3 p.m, surrounded on all sides with sails shot to ribbons and rags, Commander Robert Barclay is forced to surrender the British squadron and accept the terms of the victorious Oliver Hazard Perry. All the British ships are now property of the US Navy. Once Perry returns to port, he writes a simple message to his commanding officer, Commander and General William Henry Harrison. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." Despite the thrill of victory, Perry immediately accused his second-in-command, Lieutenant Jesse Elliott, of cowardice for not following him into the initial attack with the USS Niagara. Elliott and his crew protested and argued that Lieutenant Elliott had been following Perry's own orders, and that his holding back had ensured their victory by allowing the British to jumble their lines. But Perry, it seems, refused to see the good in Elliott's intentions. The dispute was never resolved, and the hot-tempered Perry and the soft-spoken Elliott would sadly carry the feud to their graves. Nonetheless, the victory was monumental for the United States. It was a turning point like no other in the war. In winning the Battle of Lake Erie, the Americans had captured all of Britain's ships on the lake, and therefore they had gained control of all Lake Erie. Now, there was no hope for the British and Native American armies in Detroit to be resupplied. They were forced to retreat eastwards and abandon the American soil they had claimed. General William Henry Harrison then marched north, pressing his advantage. The US Army under Harrison retook Detroit and then marched up into British North America. In Moravian Town, Harrison caught up with the retreating British, along with the Indian tribes led by his old foe Tecumseh. And there, in the Battle of the Thames, Harrison's army slaughtered the British and Native Americans. Many warriors fell on that day, but perhaps the most grievous loss was that of Tecumseh himself. When Tecumseh fell, so did his confederacy. After the battle, when the various tribes learned that their leader, the man they had rallied around, had now fallen, they scattered and dispersed. The army of the Indian Confederacy was no more, and gone too was the dream of an indigenous American nation. The US had now defeated the British twice in a row and obliterated their indigenous allies. A war that just a few months earlier looked lost was now decidedly rebalanced. Not long after this, both countries met for peace negotiations in December 1814. The Americans had proven their grit, and the British were keen to accept their terms. Ohio and Michigan remained US territories, and the door now swung open to further American expansion westwards. Just as much as the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, the War of 1812 was a conflict that shaped America as a nation. American heroes like General William Henry Harrison and Oliver Hazard Perry were revered and immortalized in the American consciousness. Symbols, too, like the Fort McHenry flag, grew to take on primal significance in American culture and politics. The Fort McHenry flag soon became the flag of the United States of America. Other symbols, too, like Uncle Sam, were first born in this conflict. Sam was there to recruit young Americans to fight against the British. And so too a song that became the Star-Spangled Banner, the rallying cry and the hymn of the young republic, was first put to paper by Francis Scott Key in the War of 1812 in the Battle of Baltimore. But most importantly of all, the War of 1812 finally won the United States respect from Great Britain. No more would Britain kidnap her sailors. No more would she arm indigenous peoples against her, and no more would she underestimate the power of America. The conflict had shown that America and its military were a force to be reckoned with. As the British diplomat Augustus J. Foster acknowledged at the time, the Americans have brought us to speak of them with respect. In 1841, several years later, William Henry Harrison, the hero of the Thames and Tippecanoe, rode his popularity all the way to the highest office in the land. On March 4th, 1841, Harrison won the general election and was sworn in as President of the United States of America. Just 9 days later, Harrison died of pneumonia after giving the longest inaugural address in history of more than 2 hours while standing outside without a coat in the pouring Washington rain. Decisions and consequences. Napoleon blockades the British blockade the Americans fight the British, and the Indians fight the Americans. Decisions and consequences. Jesse Elliott holds back at the fringe of a battle. Samuel Hambleton mans the last gun of the ship. Oliver Hazard Perry raises the flag one last time. Decisions and consequences. The British lose the Battle of the Thames. The Native Americans lose their ally. Tecumseh and the Indian nation dies with him. William Henry Harrison becomes a hero. And finally, a prophet curses the conqueror. The conqueror laughs and turns away. Decisions and consequences. Ut sementem feceris ita metes. As you sow, so shall you reap. Decisions and consequences.